Take all the cultural trappings away, and we are all just generic creatures, barraged by a continuous stream of sensations, emotions, and events, buffeted by occasional waves of existential dread until those experiences abruptly end. But in a world infused with meaning, we are so much more than that. I'm ahead of the curve, also known as James Bergman, and in today's book review I will be discussing The Worm at the Core, written by psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pyszczynski. This book is all about how we can come to understand death, to be consoled by death, and to also understand the philosophical and psychological underpinnings of our perception of mortality through history until today. This book also introduces the idea of terror management theory, also known as TMT. Terror management theory proposes that a basic psychological conflict results from having a self-preservation instinct while realizing that death is inevitable and, to some extent, unpredictable. This conflict produces terror, which is managed through a combination of escapism and cultural beliefs that act to counter biological reality with more significant and enduring forms of meaning and value. The idea that death influences our life is not exclusive to this particular book. However, what this book tries to do is to set a psychological foundation that is, as much as it can be, empirical and consistent to demonstrate that this hypothesis is true. If any of you have read The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, you will be familiar that Becker's, the critique of the book was that it was largely conjectural, and it was based on older psychology. And whilst the latter claim is harder to prove as really being a critique, it is true, however, that Ernest Becker was short of psychological studies. And what I think this book really does well is actually bring a more modern flavour to the idea that death influences our life and vice versa. And it actually maintains some empirical basis for the concept. And this is what the book outlines in general, that, not only was Ernest Becker right, not only was Kierkegaard right, not only were these older philosophers in history correct, that what we do in our life is very much dictated by our inevitable mortality. What this book does is demonstrate it on a more solid foundation rather than a mere philosophical musing. And so yes, the comparison to The Denial of Death can be made, and it should be made, because this book wouldn't be written without The Denial of Death being published. For anyone who hasn't read The Denial of Death, I will say prepare yourself, because it isn't too easy to get through. It is very difficult to comprehend a lot of the things that Becker's saying, because you don't really want to hear it in some sense. So I would say read with a strong few shots of whiskey. You could also check out my review that I did of The Denial of Death a couple of years ago. One exciting thing that I have to announce, and I don't know when this video will be out, whether I'm going to do it after the event or before. Maybe before, just to prepare you guys for it. But I am actually interviewing one of the authors, Sheldon Solomon. Now, he's featured in many interviews before. He seems like a really cool guy, and I'm so surprised that he said yes to being interviewed by me. I'm really preparing for my chat with him, and I'm just really excited about talking to him. Now we're going to get into the review, the meat of the video. Are you ready? I hope you are. So there are 3 parts of this book, not including the introduction. The first part is called Terror Management. The second part is called Death Through the Ages. And part 3 is called Death in Modern Times. In part 1, Terror Management, they introduce terror management theory and the overarching idea that what we do in life is in avoidance of our death. And they also introduce some psychological studies that they conducted, one of which was concerned with self-esteem. The authors conclude that with a higher level of self-esteem, we are able to avoid the terror of death because we are heightened to a level that allows us to not think of our mortality, to not consider it as much. And so the higher our self-esteem, the less our death anxiety. And so self-esteem encapsulates the feeling of belonging, the feeling of having a place in the world. And what the authors state is that if we don't feel like we have a place, if we don't feel like we have a meaning or a contingent existence upon something else in our life, then really we are living an arbitrary existence as far as we are concerned, and therefore the terror of death is brought more to the surface. In part 2, Death Through the Ages, the authors come to the conclusion that essentially our ancient ancestors used ritual, art, myth and religion to come to terms with their rather questionable existence. This would be to avoid social paralysis, which would arguably lead to human extinction. And so we needed something to transcend us, or us transcending something else, making something else look more important than it really is. And so on a psychological level, this would imply to us that actually our existence wasn't meaningless. It actually carried a lot of weight. And if we think about, religion specifically, that would imply that we are special. We are the center of the universe, as we once believed. And so through all of these fallacious, superficial concepts of reality around us and our relationship to the universe, we would believe that we were basically special. But in actual fact, we weren't. Simply put, our ancestors, like us today, needed fabricated meaning in order to keep on living. The authors then turn to symbolic and literal immortality. The examples they use of this is, let's say, the ancient practice of mummification. It is a ritual to try and believe that there is something after death, and that the life we have now actually affects, once we are dead and how we are prepared, let's say, it actually affects where we're going afterwards. And another example would be charismatic leaders, let's say, the Manson family. What Charles Manson did was, in a way, because the followers were lacking a parental figure and they were lacking purpose in their life, Charles Manson would make this purpose far more poignant and even transcendent to a level, because they would report seeing him like he was Jesus, or at least Charles Manson believing that he was some sort of prophet. And so what the whole point is of the charismatic leaders is that essentially they appeal to their followers in the regard of reassuring them that their life is not only worth something, but actually through death they can achieve far more with their life. So these examples illustrate the fact that we not only need belonging, but also that we need to believe that this isn't all there is. We need to believe that there is more to the present experience, to our pain and suffering. We need to believe that there is some sort of immortality in what we're doing. Think of a mother who's, let's say, given up their work to look after the family. That mother is effectively gaining her meaning from her family. She will live on through her family's well-being, how well they might do. She will be satisfied with the fact that she did all she could to continue the well-being and the life of her children, instead of actually preserving, in many cases, her own at the same time. Think of a soldier dying for his country. He is putting the country above everything else. He is putting the country above himself. And so if he were to be injured or die, at least he could say, well, it was for a greater good. All of these point to the idea that we require some sense of immortality in our lives in order to justify living. These myths and rituals and charismatic leaders and in more modern times a soldier perhaps dying for their country, all of these alleviate the stress of death. They heighten the sense of self-esteem because it feels like they are doing something beyond themselves. But at the end of the day, it is, of course, all with the denial of death. In part 3, Death in Modern Times, the authors highlight different events in the past, such as 9/11, let's say, where people have felt distanced from others who don't share their same moral values. And actually, when we are in a particular group, whether this be political or just vaguely a social one, this also carries with it a sense of immortality, because what we do in that group and how we represent ourselves in that group also exacerbates this idea that we are special and that we're part of something. We feel like what we do transcends the material even. It transcends ourselves. And not only this, but we quite often defend our beliefs to the death, whether that be through politics or sociability or familial. Further into this section, the authors discuss the link between death and intimacy. Using evidence from various psychological studies that they had conducted, they came to the conclusion that the more that you remind somebody, an individual, of their own death or mortality in general, the more likely they are going to be disgusted at the idea of the body and perhaps even intimacy. What they say is that intimacy is best regarded when it is further and further away from carnality. The idea of intimacy that people prefer to subscribe to is that which is linked with love, because love transcends, by definition, the very process of reproduction. The biological conception of it is twisted around into something that is far more meaningful and arguably transcendent than the actual activity of intimacy itself. This conception that intimacy is based on love actually alienates us from what it really is, which is an activity of reproduction. It's a biological process that we are adhering to throughout the centuries, but actually we've twisted it around into something that means far more to us than what it really is. Love is just an amalgamation of chemical reactions in our brain to encourage us to mate with another individual to then reproduce. But of course we can't believe that. We must believe that reproduction is far more special and transcendent than a mere biological imperative, right? And so this is the point that they're advocating, which is we mask these normative activities and perceptions with a, let's say, transcendent and special, exclusive twist to them to encourage us that actually things aren't as bad as they actually are. Additionally, the authors also discuss how we always like to believe that we can't be the one who's going to die. Death only happens to other people. Something like a child would believe when they're very young, with the following passage illustrating this quite well. The fact is, your brain gnaws anxiously on the bone of death more often than you think, but the ongoing operation of proximal and distal defenses keeps you from realizing it. So instead of walking around worrying about dying, proximal defenses first distract you with matters like what you will eat for lunch and who will be the next contestant to be eliminated from American Idol. Distal defenses then direct you to think about how right your beliefs are and how much you are accomplishing. What I also found really interesting was how they linked mental disorders to death. They found links between depression, schizophrenia, PTSD, and phobias. They explained how all of these actually lead to some kind of denial of death, or at the very least, there is an association between all of them that has to do with our mortality. An example, let's say with PTSD, would be if you're a soldier and you witness your friend die in some gruesome manner, and you were right there, you saw it happen. And they even cited somebody, and I won't recount it all here, but they cited somebody in this exact position. And what they explained it as was, part of it was the fact that they witnessed death happen. They witnessed it occur right in front of their eyes. And so this idea that death only happens to other people, yes, it would be perhaps reinforced, but seeing it in your own field of view means that it's more close to home than you once thought. And so that person would then adopt many different symptoms such as dissociation and so on to try and exit that kind of mentality, that realization that death exists and it's coming. They explain these findings in the following passage. We discovered that subtle and even subliminal reminders of death increase devotion to one's cultural scheme of things, support for charismatic leaders, and confidence in the existence of God and belief in the efficacy of prayer. They amplify our disdain towards people who do not share our beliefs, even to the point of taking solace in their demise. They drive us to compulsively smoke, drink, eat, and shop. They make us uncomfortable with our bodies and our sexuality. They impel us to drive recklessly and fry ourselves in tanning booths to bolster our self-esteem. They magnify our phobias, obsessions, and social anxieties. As well as this concluding point towards the end of the book, they also mentioned the biblical story of Adam and Eve, and I'll read it out here. From a biblical standpoint, the knowledge Adam and Eve gained by partaking of the apple made them mortal. From a scientific standpoint, the development of the human neocortex spawned symbolic thought, self-awareness, the capacity to reflect on the past and anticipate the future, and the knowledge of our mortality. In this way, the fall of man, the allegorical foundation of Western religion, converges with contemporary science. With increasing knowledge came the awareness of death, and that changed everything. The knowledge of death, rather than death per se, is the worm at the core of the biblical apple. It is that knowledge that made us human and initiated our unrelenting quest for immortality, a quest that profoundly influenced the course of human history and persists to this day. This was definitely one of my favourite passages. It encapsulates this idea that knowledge of death is the beginning of wisdom in some sense, and I believe that. And regarding the worm at the core from that passage being mentioned, and also obviously as the title of this book, William James actually mentioned this sort of phraseology, and I'll read out here. It's from the Varieties of Religious Experience. Back of everything is the great spectre of universal death, the all-encompassing blackness. We need a life not correlated with death, a kind of good that will not perish, a good, in fact, that flies beyond the goods of nature. And so, with most of us, a little irritable weakness will bring the worm at the core of our usual springs of delight into full view, and turn us into melancholy metaphysicians. The conclusion of this book, whilst you might not believe it, is actually in some way motivating and affirming and sobering. It's honest, and I don't mean honest in the sense that the denial of death was just flat out like, you know, death is coming, guys, beware. This book is, I don't know how to put it, it's in a weird way very consoling, because towards the end they reference other philosophers and writers, poets, who have written about death and how they are viewing it and how they're moving towards it. And I found this really, really interesting, because the best way we can understand how to view death is actually by reading people who have died or are dying. And I really liked this inclusion, these different authors talking about death, because obviously the fact of death and its inevitability is horrendous, and it's jarring, it's many things, many horrific things, I'd probably say. It's really hard to comprehend. I mean, in some sense we can't comprehend death because it's something that is by definition abstract, and so no sense of the imagination can even grasp what death is. And even if it could, which it may be able to attempt, but even if it really could, would it want to? You know, maybe our unconscious is always trying to drive it away, which we already know is empirically demonstrated. But on an even deeper level, do we even want to understand what death is? Because as the biblical passage goes, with knowledge comes sorrow, and with sorrow comes knowledge. Although I would like to counter this in this particular example and actually agree with what the authors conclude with, which is understanding death and comprehending it as something that will inevitably happen is probably a good thing in the long run. Because I know for me, I've read a lot about it. I've read people who, like Christopher Hitchens' Mortality, which is a fantastic book. I suppose it's a good book to read because it sobers you. It also discusses perceptions of death from a dying man, Christopher Hitchens. A lot of people might say, well, it's the destination that matters, but I would say no, it's more of the journey. When you watch a film, if you really wanted to, you could just watch the beginning and the very end and say, yep, done and dusted. But we watch it because we're interested in how the characters got there and how it unfolded. And that's the entire point. Life is equivocal to that. The journey is what is so important. All of it, I'd say, matters, of course, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the journey of life and the importance, of course, that death, when we understand it and when we comprehend it, when we don't shy away from it, the fact that death gives us clarity. It gives us extreme clarity on what we should value, what we should not take for granted. We should cherish things and still understand that reality as we know it individually will collapse on itself. There's something in between that, which is the now, that exists and we're here, and if we can, then we have to make the most of it, because what's the alternative? There isn't one. Ironically, I think without death, life would lose most of its meaning, to be honest. I think if we didn't die, if we were immortal, then, well, where's the urgency? Why even get out of bed in the morning? Why do anything with any rush? Why be motivated to do anything when you could just do it in the next 2,000 years? What will be the point if we have all the time in the world to do what we want to do? And so, ironically, as I said, death brings life its meaning. Without death, we are left with an eternity. And so, yeah, I think this book is obviously sobering. Obviously, it has concepts that we like to look away from in our everyday life. But I think, genuinely, the more we comprehend our own death and mortality as a subject, the more we can appreciate life as it is, and we can cherish things, and we can understand that because there is a time limit, that's all the more reason to be involved and to take part in life as much as we can possibly do. Right, so, okay. That's about it for all my musings. Great book, fantastic book. Really, just probably a favourite of mine alongside Denial of Death. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that everybody needs to read. Like, literally everybody needs to read. Because if we just ignore our death, then are we really going to live? Like, are we genuinely going to live if we just put our mortality under the carpet? Because even on a psychological level, we Freud, Becker, Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, Tom Pyszczynski, they will all agree that, yes, even if you try and shovel your issues in terms of mortality under the carpet, the bulges will still occur, that you will still have those unconscious issues. And I think that if you integrate, let's say, the Jungian shadow, if you integrate your unconscious to your conscious, and if you understand that whilst this is definitely not something nice to think about, once you get over that hurdle, then you're free. Then you're truly free. Because you're past that realization now. You're truly past it. And so I think it's really important for people to understand that they will die, and therefore how important life really is, at least on the individual level. So yeah, I hope you liked my review of The Worm at the Core. I'm really excited to interview Sheldon Solomon. I hope you guys like that discussion as well. I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.